Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are Irenicast. I am Jeff.
And this is Rajiv. And on the first and third Tuesday of every month, we bring to you our perspectives on theology and culture from a post-evangelical lens.
Thank you for joining us for another conversation to provoke your progressive Christian imagination. And what a conversation we have for you this week. This week, Alan, Bonnie, and Casey are all on assignment, and Rajiv and I got the pleasure to sit down with Dr. Larycia Hawkins and Linda Midgett of the brand new documentary that's coming out called Same God. Rajiv, give us some context on what this documentary is all about.
So Same God is a fantastic documentary. Check it out. Website's in the show notes. But essentially, Dr. Hawkins is the first tenured African-American woman at Wheaton College. She wore a hijab in solidarity with Muslim women in the aftermath of the San Bernardino shootings that was done by some religious extremists. And it created a firestorm at Wheaton College, and she was let go. And as a tenured professor, that's kind of a big deal. So the documentary is phenomenal. It's emotional, and it'll fire you up. It also places that situation firmly in the context of our political climate of the day.
Right. The events of the documentary happened on the threshold of Trump in the White House and everything that's happened since then. And wow, what a conversation. Like, literally, Rajiv and I just finished talking to both of them, and we were so blown away by the answers we were given and the context we were given for everything they were doing. So, without any further ado, we want to get right into this. This will be a longer episode than usual. We were just having a conversation. This seems like something we don't want to cut down at all or very little, just to make it as clear as possible, everything that's being said in this conversation. So we hope you enjoy all of the information that you're going to hear about the film, about how you can follow our guest this week, is going to be in the show notes as usual at irenicast.com/162. And of course, if you like what you hear and you want to continue to hear more of what we do at Irenicast, you can always help support the show by going to irenicast.com/PayPal or irenicast.com/support. So again, without any further ado, here is our conversation with Dr. Larycia Hawkins and Linda Midgett. So in regard to kind of the film, I wanted to start out by asking Linda, you specifically, what drew you to this project? What made you want to tell this story in this way, and how is that connected to maybe your faith background and maybe some of the things that were motivating factors for you personally?
Well, I am actually an alumna of Wheaton College. So when this story broke, it was December 2015 when I first saw the news blurb that said professor at Wheaton College was wearing a hijab in solidarity with women. And I looked at it and I thought, that's interesting. And I forgot about it. I was intrigued just because of the Wheaton connection. And then a couple of days later, I realized that all hell had broken loose because of this. And as the story progressed and the controversy progressed, what really was fascinating to me was the polarization that was taking place amongst evangelicals. And it's a polarization that we live with now, so it's very commonplace. But in December 2015, it was really striking. And so initially I was like, wow, this is really fascinating. All of the alumni from the school are totally divided on this, right? So some of us feel like, okay, this sort of is a Jesus-y thing she's trying to do. That seems clear. And, other alumni are like, oh, this is so terrible. She's a heretic and needs to be removed from the school. And I honestly was baffled as to why it was so extreme, why the reactions were so extreme. And that's really what I wanted to explore. I mean, it was more the rift between evangelicals as opposed to any perceived rift between Muslims and Christians. The question, of course, the big controversy of whether Muslims and Christians worship the same God is interesting to me, but I really directed the film more to answer the question of whether evangelicals worship the same God.
Ooh, yeah.
Interesting.
So the title is a little tongue-in-cheek.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. Sticking with the filmmaking aspect for another minute or so, one of the things that was interesting to me reviewing some background on how everything came together, and there's a number of people involved with making this film. And, as anything with life, you have to choose partners to do something. But like, how did you go through the process of deciding and choosing who your partners were going to be?
Yes, an interesting question. Yeah, I am not that person who can buy their way into anything that they want. So that wasn't an option. And actually, when you're an independent filmmaker, the biggest challenge is always financial. Always. I mean, I've been a television producer for several decades, and I've produced other documentaries. This is my first independent film. And so the finances have always been the biggest challenge. And I really didn't know going into it how I was going to proceed, but it was a very deep, I don't know, it's almost a compulsion, I guess is the word. Like I felt like I had to do this. To even do the first interview with Larycia, I had to have funding for it because I didn't have it. My first partner was David Vanderveen, who also, he's not really a graduate of Wheaton. He's a friend of mine from Wheaton. He ended up graduating from Calvin College in Grand Rapids. But I knew immediately when it hit me, like, this needs to be a documentary. The next thought was who can give me a little bit of seed money just to get going. And I figured David would understand sort of philosophically what I was trying to do. So he was the first person that I called, and he was excited about it and said, yeah, I'll give you enough money to get rolling. And then he brought in another executive producer, Kathy Treat, who is also a graduate of Wheaton. And that's how we got moving. So they gave me enough seed money just to do the first couple of interviews so that I could, it was very important to me to be filming while it was happening. And for this not to be just a retrospective type of story, but to be getting it in real time. And
so when in the process did you jump in? Like, where you said you heard about the news story in December of 2015. When did you jump in terms of like starting filming? When were you documenting the process? How long after that?
Yeah, I started filming with Larycia in January. And so the whole controversy lasted for about 2 months total. I think it was 60 days, actually. And I was somewhere right in the middle of that. We laugh about this because we have a little funny story, but the first interview I did with Larycia was in Houston, and she was there because she had a family member who was getting treatment for cancer. And I had never talked to Larycia directly because she was in such a firestorm. She couldn't answer her own email. But I had gone through a friend of hers who was checking her email. And so the friend had vetted me and said to Larycia, I think you should do this. And so the first interview I did with Larycia, we had never even had a conversation. And I would not have done the documentary without her participation. I mean, there was no point in doing that. But driving to Houston from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where I live now, there was a funny moment where I thought, okay, what if I get there and she's crazy? Because I haven't talked to her. Like, I had no way to know what was, and I'm like, oh. But, of course, that's not what happened. I met her and realized that she's lovely in many ways, and was kind of relieved also to find out, like, okay, this is kind of what the story that I think it's going to be.
Right. And Larycia, how was that for you? I can't imagine being in the middle of all that media and everything. On top of that, agreeing to be filmed even more. Like, what for you, catapulted you in the decision to be like, no, I want to do this.
It's hard to remember what was going through my mind at that moment relative to the film. I just knew I trusted my girlfriend and that she thought, what have you got to lose? I didn't know how filmmaking worked. I thought, I didn't know what it was going to become, I didn't know that it would become like pretty much for the next, 2.5 years that we would be filming together. I just had no clue.
I didn't either, to be fair, Larycia. So,
Well, because we've talked about this so much together, Linda also often says she didn't know if she would get there and figure out that I was crazy and that's why I was being fired. Like they wanted to fire me, or and she said, well, as a filmmaker, I would have made that work, she's crazy and that's what happened, but it opens up this other possibility. So it's funny because I could tell the story for her and she could tell the story for me. But relative to what was going through my mind at that moment, it was just like, well, everything's already crazy, and my friend Ruth, who was checking my email, she's one of my best friends from college, and I went to college in Houston as well. We actually filmed at my friend's house, who said, I vetted this woman. I watched her documentaries. I checked out, she's won Emmy Awards and all of this stuff. And I remembered actually that one of Linda's documentaries had been, or maybe both of them had been screened at Wheaton College while I was there. And that I was unable to attend because it's like one of those days where there's a million things happening on a college campus. So I was like, sure, I can interview with the lady. It's not like signing my life away or something. And so that's, I just kind of trusted my friend Ruth and I was like, whatever. I didn't think it was going to be like the Kardashian show or something or whatever they call that. keeping up with the Larycia, So, and we didn't know, I didn't know how long it was going to drag on, right? Like Linda said, I was there because my mom had, cancer. She was being treated at MD Anderson. So in the middle of that, I was like, yeah, I'm going to keep going. My sister and I, or my dad, one of us would always accompany her. And this was a very big appointment for her. And so I was in Houston and I also spoke at my alma mater, Rice University, which is right there in Texas, and then met with Linda. So this was all one trip where this happened. But I think our first interview, Linda says, was 4 hours. Maybe.
It was. And we still didn't make it through everything. We ran out of time because you had to go somewhere for some other engagement. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think a thank you to Ruth is deserved.
Yeah.
Right. The documentary is powerful, and we haven't said it yet, but we'll say it several times to our listeners. Watch this documentary, find a way to see it. Same God.
Absolutely.
One of the central pieces of the documentary is this idea of embodied solidarity. Where did that come from?
So, I was a professor for your listeners who don't know, I was a professor at Wheaton College. It was my first academic job after graduate school. And Wheaton College is a Christian university. It's interdenominational. And we have students ranging from Seventh-day Adventist to Assemblies of God to Catholic to Baptist, like I grew up, to Presbyterian to Episcopal. And I'm being, I'm casting this vision because there's a lot of theological diversity at Wheaton College. What kind of unites people at Wheaton is they understand that the flavor of this Christian university is evangelical. And the way that I appropriate that term as a scholar is different than the way I think people think about evangelical as individuals who wear that term, is different than the way that evangelicals are thought of in society and politics. And so I'm at an institution essentially that is considered the flagship evangelical institution academically, the Harvard of Christian colleges, it's often called. And so it's this very brilliant students, wonderful students, brilliant colleagues. And in the midst of that, teaching students who keep me accountable for what I'm talking about, both from a spiritual perspective, but also from a theoretical perspective. As a political science professor, I can't tell my students to do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with God and the universe unless I'm willing to do that. And at least I can't embody that contradiction. And so I just started to be honest with my students about the fact that, when you're going for the holy grail in academia, which is tenure, you have to do a lot of sitting on your butt in the library, publishing, at a school like Wheaton, teaching, mentoring, doing community service. And what that means is you're not out there doing justice, loving mercy, walking humbly. Now, my calling to be a professor is important, but those other callings are equally important from my vantage point. So I started kind of professionally, pedagogically, personally thinking, what does it look like to have my students begin to live out? I first called it like being an embodied question mark, like speaking truth to power, like the prophets would. That's kind of how it started. Isaiah, like the prophets, especially Isaiah chapter 1, became very central to my thinking about what does it mean to be a Christian in a world where always in evangelicalism, your individual righteousness is emphasized, but not the justice part. And these aren't separate tracks. What the prophets make clear is these are inseparable. These aren't parallel things. They're actually wedded. You can't say you're righteous if you're not doing justice. If righteous folks supposedly live in a city and the city is not rejoicing, meaning prospering in their bodily welfare, material welfare, then something's off, right? Then the righteous folk aren't taking care of their own and they're not taking care of the other. So I just began thinking, like, what does it look like as a professor at an institution with resources? I'm sending kids out to help rewrite the Macedonian Constitution. Literally, a former student went to Harvard and as a law student was helping rewrite the constitution of a country. What does it look like to embody justice? So it started off as, let your presence be the thing that calls institutions to bear. And then it was like, well, actually, that's still kind of stuck up in the head and like integrating body and spirit. I mean, I used to always tell my students, we're not just this. You're not just minds. We're not just developing your mind. We're developing your whole person here. I know this is a long answer, but I'm a professor. What am I going to do? So essentially it just became like, how do we get out of the classroom and into the world? Period. So how do we embody solidarity, not just talk about it? And so I started saying theoretical solidarity isn't solidarity. Talking about justice in theory in the classroom is one thing, but how are we going to actualize that and activate that in the world? And so I started a peace and conflict studies program at Wheaton, went to a conference at Notre Dame, God bless the Catholics, the mothership, and then came back with the knowledge from Notre Dame and wrote curriculum, got it passed. And I was literally in the first semester of teaching. I was in the intro to peace and conflict studies class when I got the text from my department chair saying, "Are you going to this meeting?" I had the scarf on my head, right? I'm in my final class. It's the final exam. They're giving presentations. And I had my phone out because I was taking their pictures, and I get the text. And I just know, like, this is the beginning of the end. It's the beginning of the end. Like I say, I didn't know that for sure, but I thought all hell's about to break loose. But that's how embodied solidarity started. That phrase came together in that class, in that classroom at Wheaton College. But I had been thinking about it for years. So it's kind of this build up to what does it look like for me to be teaching people who are supposed to embody Jesus, right? So I started calling it embodied solidarity because that's what I think the Sermon on the Mount Jesus did. So.
And Larycia, for you, I'm curious, where's if you got feedback or if you feel like there's a line or a connection or, I don't know, to use a term that's overused, a slippery slope between a cultural embodiment, which I think, I'm in solidarity with this group, and cultural appropriation, where you're taking one of their symbols and, making it your own. How did you maneuver through that aspect of? You mean
me wearing the hijab specifically?
Yes, correct. Mm-hmm.
So it was December 10th, 2015, and I'm sticking to the date, the timeline, just because it's important. December 10th was the last week of classes at Wheaton College, and a student approached me about wearing the hijab home on an airplane. And I told her, I said, this is a great idea, because this was right after San Bernardino. the shootings had happened in San Bernardino. You guys are in California. I know you remember it better than a lot of people in the US because we forget there are so many. That's a different topic, gun violence, right?
Right.
But that gun violence happened to be initiated by a Muslim extremist, right? We got Christian extremists, but this was a Muslim extremist and his partner, presumably. And so in the wake of that, if you and your listeners recall, there was a lot of anti-Muslim vitriol. And so my student's idea, she was in my senior seminar at the time, and we were talking about these themes in my senior seminar called The Christian Life and Politics, right? So how do we translate this political thing into living out our lives as Christians in the world? So we're talking about the same concepts in my senior seminar. And she said, I would like to wear the hijab on the airplane home and have college students do it and have it be this event, right? Because that's how millennials think. These one-shot things, put it on social media. All her college friends across the country would do it. And I thought, this is a great idea, but we need to talk to our Muslim brothers and sisters about, would this be considered haram, unclean? Is this defiling of the concept of hijab? And I called some friends of mine. I had a relationship with several Muslims. What I realized in retrospect, all my Muslim friends were men at the time, friends from graduate school. I served on a board. So I was very active and engaged in the labor community in Chicago. And I was on the board of a group called Arise Chicago. So I had 2 Muslim colleagues on the board. I called the Council on American Islamic Relations to ask them, what do you think? My student wants to do this. She wants to do this as an act of Christian devotion in solidarity with her Muslim sisters. Well, as college students are, I called CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations. They said, let us talk to the board. Since my friend was a man, he's like, let me talk to the women on the board and see what they think. He called back. He said, we think this is a wonderful idea. In fact, Larycia, we want to make this educational. Have your students keep a journal. And then we'll have a panel after Christmas or after the holidays and the winter holidays, and have a Muslim woman who wears a hijab, a Muslim woman who doesn't, your college students who do. And I told him, I'm going to participate, right? So we had a plan. Literally the night before I did the Facebook post, or maybe that morning, I emailed and I said, I want to err on the side of caution. I think that maybe we won't do it. And they were like, no, we called our friends at CBS News to tell them we have these friends who are supporting us. And we want them to do a story. So that's the night that I posted. I didn't hear from my student. She was busy doing college student things the last week of school, but I did my Facebook post. And so it was a Facebook post that initiated some of the controversy. That's where I said Muslims and Christians and Jews, but I didn't put that in the Facebook post because I was talking about my Muslim neighbor. And I talked about embodied solidarity, and that's why I was wearing the hijab. So I'm answering your question by saying the Muslim community wasn't asking about cultural appropriation. People outside the Muslim community have asked about cultural appropriation. And in fact, when I got to class, since it was the last week of school, I had my final class that Friday. It was a Thursday that I made the Facebook post. That Friday, a student in my class who is of Syrian descent, her mom is Syrian, said, how is this not cultural appropriation? And we had a conversation the last day of Peace and Conflict Studies regular semester class. And we talked about the fact, some of it's about intent. Some of it is this meant to be, for some people, fashion? Hijab is not fashion, right? Hijab is a concept that is utilized, means honor God with your body. And some it's not in the Quran. And some people interpret the hijab as for all Muslims, whether they put a scarf on their head literally or not, or whatever. There are many forms of hijab too, forms of covering one's head in various cultures, or covering one's body. And in fact, men wear a hijab is the way one of my friends in the Muslim community talks about it, because it's all about honoring God with our body. And I said, oh, well, in the Christian community, we talk about putting on the armor of God, and that our bodies are a temple. And so the concept is similar for a Christian. And also Mary, the mother of God, wore a hijab, right? And so the only way that I would have done it and my student would have done it is with the blessing of the Muslim community. Clearly, we didn't poll every Muslim.
Right, for sure.
But the response I still get today is, you did this out of support and like embodied solidarity with us. And then they usually say, and you lost your job. I mean, Linda and I were just in Chicago, and a woman comes up to me, and that's what she says to her little girl. This lady lost her job for us.
Right.
Wow.
You know, so,
Yeah. That's super helpful context. Like, I think that partnership being a central focus of that. And then that last point that you made being huge in the sense that you lost as a result, as opposed to gain something, which tends to be
I mean, I will say that as somebody who's sort of walked alongside Larycia now for 4 years, one of the things that I've learned about embodied solidarity by observation and by being part of this process is that it's really taking somebody else's burden. And that's the exact opposite to me, in my mind, from cultural appropriation. There were no rewards for what Larycia did. There was condemnation. There have been tremendous sacrifices. And so the burden of vitriol that Muslim women were experiencing then and continue to experience now, Larycia shared with them. And we show the film a lot in Muslim communities, and there is a tremendous sense of gratefulness for that, because the loving intent behind it, I think, is very clear to them. That's the difference.
Yeah. And I think it's a great question. I wanted to err on the side of over-explaining, in part because I never want to be seen as shutting down that question, even because the outcome amongst the Muslim community is generally positive. I'm not saying that makes it okay, right?
Right.
What I'm saying is, I do want to say to liberals, progressives, people left of center, whatever you call oneself, I think, and this goes back to the whole issue of me wearing the hijab, of the moment that we're in, the polarized moment that we're in, where families don't eat Thanksgiving dinner together anymore. Part of it is there's a rush to judgment on all sides. There's not just two sides. And cultural appropriation is something that people throw down like a gauntlet or a bomb to sometimes end conversation. And again, I'm not saying that's what you were doing. It's a very appropriate question. But I think it's something on the left that people trot out as a way of defending people who don't need defending. Muslim women are some of the strongest women I've ever met in my life, right? And I think that a lesson for me, as someone who would be considered by the world very left of center or very left of center, depending on who you are and where you sit, right?
Right.
Because it's all relative, is that when I was at Wheaton, people had begun kind of almost when I got to Wheaton in 2007 to talk about social justice warriors and people who only want to interpret the justice part of the Bible. And it has to be read in its totality. The reason I love the Isaiah passage is it speaks to both. It's righteousness and justice, right? And that in the midst of one of the problems of Christianity, not just evangelical Christianity, is the camps are the righteous on the one side, the ones who want to do the righteousness lovers, the justice lovers, and we can't separate them. If we're Jesus people, it's both and all the time, simultaneously. Works with grace, faith without works. These go together. And so I love the cultural appropriation question because I think it chastises all of us in a good way to think about the fact that the outward works, yes, can just be works, but we do have to look at the heart and the intent behind it and the context in which it's happening. And I think that it's the context that is easy to lose, that what was happening at the time was really grievous and serious. And in the context of the moment, it really meant a lot. And Muslims, more than most groups, get the context of what was happening then, and what's happening now is even worse, right? But to your point, I'm very careful now about, there's World Hijab Day just passed on February the 1st. It's important for me now to be invited in. And a point that I wanted to make is, if we went to a mosque, it would behoove women to bring a scarf and put it on their head out of deference and respect. If I go to a Japanese tea room, I take off my shoes. If I go to a majority Muslim country, women should probably bring a scarf and put it on their head, because that's appropriate in context. All of my Christian missionary friends call God Allah and wear the hijab when they live in Tunisia or Morocco or wherever they're missionaries, right? And so context really matters for these questions. And the context of the time is like, some shit was going down and I wasn't going to let it happen without being in solidarity. So it's funny, because my student did not show up with a hijab on her head the next day at school. 1 or 2 colleagues did, and 1 or 2 students did. And one student was the recipient of violence on campus at Wheaton College as a result. So, yeah.
Well, that response has so many wonderful layers to it, and I really appreciate you giving, honoring us with a thorough overview of your thought process.
You mean like being too talkative?
No. I'm a former educator too, and I'm a former preacher. So
you got me.
It's like, because it's rare when you're a public figure. It's rare that you get your side really explained and the thought processes. And so this in some ways is a longer form opportunity to do that. But embedded in your response, well, let me say this. A lot of times we will ask, as folks in work like this, we will ask this question of white folks. And oftentimes there isn't an answer. And what I'd like to lift up is your answer is almost a mini handbook on how to do this, on how to do embodied solidarity with a group that isn't your own. If anybody's thinking about what solidarity looks like, and you're not part of the group you're trying to stand up for, your answer is a fantastic model that folks can adopt. So I thank you for that. I want to jump backwards a little bit to Wheaton College. You talked about the theological diversity and so on, and I'm very much an outsider when it comes to Wheaton.
Did you go to a Christian school?
I did.
Okay.
I did go to a Seventh-day Adventist college, and I did my graduate studies at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. So, the largest consortia of seminaries in the world, very liberal, progressive. So, universe is away. But one of the things that I immediately look at when I look at Christian institutions like Wheaton, like where I went to undergrad, is this, in essence, a white supremacist organization that uses Christian theology and dogma to propagate white supremacy? And from a distance, I'm thinking, and then there's the claims, well, like where I went to school was very racially diverse, but it was white supremacist. It's like, the white way is the right way. And then there's this religious stuff that you do too. In your experience, and as I was learning about Wheaton through your experience and then trying to find out on my own, I was like, holy smokes, this place looks to me like a flagship of that model, where it is really a white supremacist institution that uses the Christian message and sort of the veneer of plurality to propagate that idea. So am I totally wrong? Is there some truth to that observation?
So, yes. And I say yes because I think Wheaton, your college, University of Virginia, where I teach now, all of these are white supremacist institutions. They can't not be unless they decide to be intentionally anti-racist. And most institutions in this country have not decided that they're down for that. Because to do so would be to dissociate from the meritocracy and all those things that keep these institutions going, or so they think, right? Money is the mother's milk of the United States. It's capitalism, period. And so these institutions can't not be white supremacist institutions. That's not a way of not answering your question more personally. I can talk all day about the ways that Wheaton College is unaware of the ways that it's white supremacist. What I will also tell you honestly from the bottom of my heart is I know that my provost hired me because he was determined to increase the diversity of Wheaton College because he believed it would make Wheaton better. I know he believed that. But what white supremacist institutions don't know, and the people who work in them, however kind and good-hearted they are about not using diversity as a token, it becomes a token when you get the people there and you don't know how to deal with them. You don't build the structures, you don't change the structures or build new structures to keep them. So you have something called faculty retention. How many of these faculty of color and women that you bring in are staying? How many of them are getting tenure? How's their health faring? Did you develop high blood pressure when working at that institution? Yeah. Did you begin taking a little white pill every day so you could check your damn email? Yeah. So the reality is the white power structure, I don't believe is going to change from within unless they do the thing that you just said I did, which I've never framed it in the way you did. Thank you for calling it like a playbook. I'm like, I like you. You can follow me around everywhere I go and tell me like how I need to frame stuff. I wrote the handbook on how. No, I'm saying that because it was helpful for me to hear that the thing that I began doing is saying, I came there in part because I'm an educator. I came there in large part because I'm a Christian. I'm a political scientist who happens to be a Christian who studies the intersection of religion, race, ethnicity, and politics, which means I also study gender and sexuality. And so I'm a lightning rod everywhere I go. I didn't grow up calling myself a lightning rod. And then I guess I got to Wheaton and I became the blackest Black woman there ever was. And I became a lightning rod, and everywhere I went, I was causing controversy. And that's fine because that's what I was there as a woman who was raised in a Black church in the spirit of the prophetic voice and the Black Moses, and Black Jesus explicitly or implicitly, because we had a picture of white Jesus in my church, just so you know, because like we all internalize white supremacy and colonialism. And so I was there to unroot it from myself and my students and the institution. And white supremacist institutions don't like that.
Mm-hmm.
Prophets get killed in this country.
Mm-hmm.
Everywhere.
Yep.
And that's the nature of the prophet. And I'm not calling myself a prophet. I'm talking about the prophetic voice. People want to root it out and silence it. That's how white supremacist institutions work. So we just didn't know what it was getting. They thought they were getting a Black girl who got evangelicalism because I was in Campus Crusade in college. But I didn't call myself an evangelical. And by the way, all Christians are supposed to be evangelical because that's what the Bible says. You're supposed to share the good news. But it's a thing. It's a difficult thing. For people to be confronted with their own racism. So I finally said, stop telling me to tell you how to be racist because you don't want to know. America don't want to know. Wheaton don't want to know because America don't want to know. And that's what's happening in our country right now. People are being confronted with their racism. So all of a sudden, white people got politics.
Right. Right.
And that's what's happening.
That's right.
That's my short explanation. Identity politics is all the rage because now white people figured out they white and they got something to protect.
And I wanted to ask you about that, actually, identity politics, as it's related to embodied solidarity. How do you link or delink the two notions?
I think identity politics is American politics. Interest group politics is identity politics. The wonderful thing about this country is at any given time around any issue or problem, we can form groups. We can lobby at multiple levels of government. That's beautiful. But all of a sudden, when Black and brown, indigenous, women, gay, queer, trans people do it, it's identity politics. Oh, but then when the white majority realizes it's going down, that they might not, but by the way, they'll be an economic power for a long damn time. But all of a sudden, a Black man is elected and there's a threat. And now white identity politics are okay, and they're embracing it. Believe me, it's being embraced. And so identity politics has always been, and it's only critiqued when the most oppressed, when the sleeping giant, right, wakes up. It's very Marxian, right? It's all of a sudden when those who are powerless move into their power, that the power structure suppresses it. That's what's happening. Mm-hmm. And now it's called identity politics by people on the left, the progressive left, and the right. It's the genteel, moderate right, the people who like the Blacks and stuff, the neocons, the crunchy cons, you know, the environmental conservatives. They're the ones condemning identity politics. It's not Breitbart. It's not Steve Bannon. They're pro-identity politics. And you know who on the left is condemning identity politics? The elite folks in the academy that I'm in, whose parents were PhDs or art dealers or whatever. It's the moneyed left. They're not too wealthy. They're not the wealthy class, but they're the comfortable six-figure class. They're in the top 10%. And the reality is, yes, it's economic, but it's also racial. And so I'm a critiquer of the left and the right, and you don't have to like me. I don't care. I call it as I see it, but that's the reality. Embodied solidarity is not about identity politics because everyone needs embodied solidarity at some point. But the Jesus I know saw the least and the last and the left out. And so moving to those places of marginalization and oppression in general, it tends to take me towards the economically oppressed, which tend to map onto people of color, the environmentally oppressed, and there are white folks in that group, in both of those groups, and just those people that we refuse to see, those that we keep pushing down. And so my prayer about embodied solidarity is that God would give me the eyes to see the oppressed, whoever they are and wherever they are. So there's no sifting line. This isn't like anti-white. If I'm anti-racist, then it's not about excluding the powerful. The powerful need solidarity. They have a form of poverty. It's about going to the poor.
Yeah. That was the thing that struck me about coming into the documentary, was thinking this is going to be more of a theological issue. But I think that the framework, it really became in a lot of ways an issue about race within those theological frameworks. Mm-hmm. And kind of, you know, as and Linda, for you as a filmmaker, as someone whose language is visual, one of the things that struck me in the very beginning of the documentary was the juxtaposition of talking about Wheaton as this first stop on the Underground Railroad, accompanied by images of pristine Southern style buildings and pillars, and then the juxtaposition with Larycia sitting in a Mexican food restaurant with other people of color, and seeing the difference between what it looks like to say something and not have it match, and the difference between just living in it and not having to say a word about it. And I really appreciated how that set the tone. So after you're kind of in the midst of this firestorm of everything that's happening, and you're filming and you're documenting and all that kind of stuff, when you sit down to do the editing process and then start to craft the story visually, what were some of the things that really informed the way that you put that together?
Yeah, well, one of the things that's interesting about being a filmmaker is that every story, every project, every film kind of has a life of its own. So it's interesting to me, even hearing your analysis of it, because honestly, some of those things are just subconscious. Like I would like to say, oh, we really thought that out. But sometimes it's not something that you are necessarily even aware that you are doing. There are visual themes that emerge as we're filming. And some of them I'm very aware of. Some of them I'm not aware of until we sit down and start the edit. I wish my editor were on this call because she could, I can't take credit for the beautiful job that she did editing and that part of the storytelling. Leslie Pupasal is my editor. I just think she was brilliant at doing. I don't know. The film has, it has a life of its own. It's funny. We realized at some point, wow, we have all of this footage of Larycia putting on makeup. And so Larycia is always like getting in the car. She puts her makeup on in the car. And I learned these things about her, right? I observed her for 2.5 years. Part of that is that's just life. That's what we happen to be capturing. But when you go and put it in a film, it somehow becomes emblematic of Larycia and this, outward face that she has to the public, the idea of her being perceived one way and not understood, like not seen for who she is. Like there are all of these levels of meaning that happen visually that are very deep and subconscious. And all I can tell you as a filmmaker, at some point, my editor and I are like, yeah, we like this theme of her putting on makeup. And I knew it was important. There's a scene in the film where her makeup mirror has cracked and she makes a little joke about it. But the cameraman says to her, and you hear the audio in the film, he says, "Is that cracked?" And she said, "Yeah, it's broken." And she said, "It's a metaphor." And it's funny because as many times as the film has been screened, sometimes the audience laughs at that, but they laugh because it's true. It's not funny. It's true. She is cracked. She is broken. And so it pulls in all of that footage. And I feel inarticulate.
It's funny. I interpret it another way.
How do you interpret it?
This is so funny. We have never talked about this scene. Y'all got this out of us. Good job, Veronica. I interpret it as bad luck.
Oh,
I had dropped the mirror. I think it was in an airport or a bathroom, and it's just one of these big, you saw the film, but if you don't remember, I'm actually inside putting on makeup, not in my car. And but it was one of those big things with eyeshadow in it, and it had the huge mirror because it got too many eyeshadows that you never use, and so that's how they get you to buy it. You think you're going to use it, you never do. So I used the same 3 little things, and they're almost all out. But then I dropped it, and so the mirror cracked. And a cracked mirror is bad luck, isn't it?
Right.
7 years of bad luck
right.
or something. And so in my mind, I was saying it's a metaphor for my life, like bad luck, Anyway, and it's funny, but it can be read in many ways, which is what art does, right? It allows people to read into it, whatever.
It does, and it's fascinating. It's really fascinating. Some of the things I'm very aware of. Some of the things when we're filming, I know I can feel it. I don't even know how to explain it. I will tell you one of the most exciting shoots for me was when I filmed Larycia with you and Michael Mangus at the church that you guys attended. I felt like the Spirit of God, not just because it was a church, but I felt that with me as a filmmaker. It was like, oh, this is really important. And that footage has been really important to me because it comes at the end of the film. And it happens to be a church where there are people of every color, they're LGBTQ, everybody's welcome. And there's this little moment in the footage where there's a little white baby that gets communion. And then right after that, it's a little black baby that gets communion. And it's beautiful to me. And sometimes
see, I never thought about that either because it's my church. And they bless the baby, or if the parent lets them, they give the baby a little cracker or piece of bread. So some parents let the baby get the bread, and some people probably grew up Baptist and they're like, no, you can bless the baby,
Yeah. Well, and
or Seventh-day Adventist or whatever.
Too. But to me, that scene is important because I feel like it's a picture of what the world is supposed to look like, right? That everybody's there and loving, and that's a very obvious way to read it. But I actually fought to keep that scene in the film, even though the initial cut of the film was 2 hours and 20 minutes. And I was like, oh, I bet we can trim 10 minutes out of this. So I trimmed and I cut it down to 95 minutes. So I cut about, 40 minutes of the film out because I just had to be really ruthless in what are the most important parts of the story. But I fought to keep that scene in because it's really important to me,
The Eucharist is important to me as emblematic of the leveling that Jesus does, right? Because embodied solidarity is about radical equality, but it's also about a preferential option for the poor, because Catholic social teaching has really affected my teaching at Wheaton. We always talked about Catholic social teaching and a seamless garment, a consistent ethic of life. So for me, that's another thing that informs my views of embodied solidarity. The idea that if all of this stuff is true, the Jesus movement, what it means to me, it's radical liberation of all people, materially as well as spiritually, but then also radical leveling. And the table, the Eucharistic table in an Episcopal church, all are welcome at the table. All are welcome. And to me, that is the message of Jesus. Whoever you are, wherever you're from, in this table, you can eat and drink and be fed and be satisfied. It's the opposite of material consumption in the US. It really is being consumed by the body of Christ, not consuming. It's when I step into that, I am being consumed by the reality, a different kingdom. And to me, that's the picture. Embodied solidarity is moving into that radical reality of equality, period. So the Eucharist, that's what the Eucharist means to me. And for me in the film, it's my church. So it's hard for me to look at my church and not just see what I love about my church. And to me, like the babies going up and getting blessed or getting a little bit of communion bread, it's just part of it. But to me, that is the loveliest part of the service, because that reality grips me. When I'm like, do I believe this stuff? It's the Eucharist. That's the only thing that keeps me going. That's the only vision. That's the only vision. Because God's people don't act like God's people. And the only thing that reminds me that I want to be a part of that is that vision. Period.
Yeah, I can relate to that pretty deeply. It's like for that one moment, we're together.
Mm-hmm.
And
even in that moment, I've been giving communion and I said, the body of Christ. And the guy said, metaphorically. We can't even be together in that moment, friend. I wish.
But, Larycia, this is what I was going to say, that, and not to go down a rabbit hole, but, I grew up in a tradition where, first of all, it wasn't called the Eucharist. It was the Lord's
Me too.
Supper.
I know.
The Lord's Supper.
But it was also
my papa is rolling in his grave.
Yeah, I've spent many years in churches where it's always explicitly said, don't come to the table if you have unconfessed sin, and this is only for Christians, only if you believe. Like there's a very strong message of don't come to the table, kind of if you aren't worthy.
And I've been to a church where you can't come to the table if you're not a certain kind of Lutheran.
Yeah.
You can be Christian, but you can't come if you're not Missouri Synod Lutheran.
It's fascinating. It's such a long discussion. I grew up in a very non-denominational evangelical background, but I've spent a lot of time in Presbyterian churches. But my children go to a Catholic school here in Southwest Louisiana. It always was kind of funny to me when they first started going to school there, and they have Mass every Friday. They can't take communion because they're not Catholic. And so they receive a blessing, right? So you cross your hands over your chest and you receive the blessing. And my children came home from school and they said, Mom, we can't take communion. We have to X ourselves out.
Oh my gosh.
They X themselves out by crossing their hands on their chest.
Wow.
But it says a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
I mean, if you two want to come back, we can do a whole episode on just the Eucharist and then the whole episode on just embodied solidarity.
Just say, this is your show, not ours. Sorry.
No,
we
this
got
is
off on the Eucharist.
this is good. That's deeply meaningful. Yeah, I've heard that whole Yeah, it's interesting. And I don't know what it is about me, my personality, but I've been in churches and been in settings where they'll say that from up front. I'm like, that, I'm going to walk up. And at this point, I've gotten the side eye from people, but the priest or whoever, the presider, is never quite sure if I'm like faking or real, but they can see that I'm there to receive communion. So to date, I haven't been denied yet.
Yeah.
And that's been interesting. I keep thinking that'll happen, but I don't visit that many churches anymore. I'm pretty plugged into my local congregation, but yeah, it's like I've never felt like that should be denied to anyone in any circumstance. And if people are saying it should be, I'm like, no, I don't think so. So yeah, the variance around that is pretty interesting. And the whole, well, it's metaphorical. Okay. Or it's don't bite it or it'll bleed. Okay. Yeah.
Right. And I think that in the midst of all that, I think that's the beauty of using this medium to tell this story, is that it leaves room for people to see a part of their tradition in it, to create that connection and see, this is more than just a news story that I either read about or saw a clip on going past and formed this full opinion on, but now seeing it in a visual way and looking at all the different dynamics of it. I personally, I'm drawn towards the medium of film, and I really appreciated the way that all this was put together, and that how the story was told in the midst of that. And kind of going through that whole experience, Larycia, I'm curious, a lot of times throughout the story that was told is that you would say, I'll sign the statement of faith. I'll sign the statement of faith. I'm fine signing the statement of faith. And I wonder now, after all this has happened and where you are now, how your own faith and theology evolved, and if you could still say that you would sign the statement of faith today.
This is a great question. I knew you were going to say that when you phrased it, but no one's ever particularly asked me if I would sign it today. It has been a difficult journey. I like to say it spiritually. I've really tried to avoid language of faith because, especially since this happened, I'm more aware of that. In part because I think there's a really facile way that evangelicals use this term, faith. There's a facile way that evangelicals talk about the church, when really they mean evangelical churches and certain kinds of evangelical churches in particular. Even in the film, someone refers to the church. A friend of mine refers to the church, Jean Green, whom I love. But I don't think he meant the Catholic Church. I don't think he meant the Holy Catholic Church, small c. And I used to tell my students at Wheaton, when you talk about the church, you mean evangelical. You mean Protestant. And I tried to, get that out of them, disabuse them of using that phraseology. And in the same way, when people talk about faith these days, I don't know what they mean anymore. It's very personalized. And I think that for me, I like to say that I'm on a spiritual journey. And this is also what I would tell my students at Wheaton. I think that all of us want to be met where we are on our, if people want to call it their faith journey, on our spiritual journey. And I think faith is exclusive as a term in the way that it's used. All of my friends who are spiritual, some of them would never talk about faith, having faith. And so where I am on my own spiritual journey is trying to hang in and to maintain those, I like to call them liturgies of life. I think James Carse calls it everyday experiences. He's got a book about it. But it's what are these everyday experiences that point me to the Jesus? So seeing Jesus in my Muslim friends. When I was at Wheaton, I used to always visit students who were studying in developing countries. So I've mostly visited the poorest countries in the world. And if those were the only places I went, yay, because I learned so much about what it means to live Jesus, live radical hospitality from the poorest people to people with the least to give, often give the most, not often, always give the most to strangers and friends alike. And so when I talk about my spiritual journey, I talk about the fact that it's been really hard since I left Wheaton to step into churches, because these places that used to be my home, people may not know. In the film, we visit my childhood church here in Oklahoma. My grandfather was my pastor. I was baptized by my grandfather 2 days before he died in the church. And churches are formative to my earliest memories of who I am. And specifically the Black Baptist church that I grew up in. And now the church feels unsafe. It used to feel like a home, and now it feels like a place that it feels very hard to go into. And I'm not angry at God and the universe, but I'm honest with God about the fact that it's really difficult right now to want to grapple with these questions. And so I just tell people, I told my pastor recently when he asked how I was doing, I said, I'm in this space where I don't know how I am, and that has to be okay. Because part of what my spiritual journey has been reading theology, taking a whole class on the Reformation so I could read the Reformers in the original, as an undergrad. And I'm done with that. I'm done with reading about what it means to be a Jesus follower. And I'm living into what it means to be a Jesus follower the best way I know how, embodying solidarity, the way that I think Jesus did on the Sermon on the Mount. And so that's where I am. And yes, my mom is like, did you go to church today? Why did you, Reverend Sheets is not your Reverend. All those jokes we have in the Black Baptist church, whatever. That's where I am. Not whatever. I mean, it's consequential. It feels really hard to talk about, but that's where I am on my spiritual journey. Is everyone wants to be met where they are, and I want to be met where I am, and that's where I am. But I would never sign a statement of faith again as a principle, because I've decided they're litmus tests.
In your voice, those of us that have been through cycles or periods where we've had to separate from the places of our formation in childhood, I can hear pain and longing in your voice that resonates with my own pains and my own longings. And we have a lot of listeners who are going through periods of transition as well. Could you just offer some words of personal advice and maybe some coping strategies that you have found useful?
Yeah. I think the best thing the hardest thing for me was to be kind to myself. And I want to say, actually, this difficulty of my spiritual journey started while I was still at Wheaton. When I say that the Eucharist is very meaningful to me, when I was at Wheaton, and all my friends know this, all my friends, close friends at Wheaton knew this while I was there, because people often have this thing when you work at the flagship evangelical institution, it's evangelicalism on steroids. So I had several friends who were like, if this is what it means to be a Christian, maybe I'm not a Christian, There's a weird kind of air there. It's rarefied air. And in the evangelical ivory tower. And so I remember being like, if this is what it means to be a Christian, maybe I'm not one. And this is maybe 2 years in, and I was like, Larycia, do you believe this? Kind of like in the scripture when the guy says to himself, self, let's build bigger barns. And then his life is taken from him. I was like, self, do you believe this? And I was like, what's the craziest thing that the Jesus says? And it's like, unless you eat my body and drink my blood. And I was like, do you believe that? This is a conversation with myself, in my head, in my body. And all I could say was, yes, that still has meaning to me. And it really did become a very literal meaning. Like, it was the Eucharist that I longed for. It was that vision, even if it started as metaphorical vision, it became for me a literal thing, a living thing. Presbyterians like to say there's a special grace that you receive. I'm like, well, whatever. But it's not magic, but the mystery that I think Protestants lack, that many Catholics still preserve. So that mysticism, the icons, like the bloody cross, became meaningful to me. Like the idea of Jesus suffering, like suffering is what God's people do. God's people are wilderness people. They're stuck in the wilderness. They're stuck in the desert. They're eating locusts. They're burning up under a tree, and this is who we're called to be. And we're caught up in this materialist culture so much so that we don't get that. In my background, as a Black woman, my inheritance is of a spirituality that does not separate sacred and secular. That's an Enlightenment thing. It's not just an American thing. It's a post-Enlightenment thing. And that is not how I want to live my life. I want to live my life seeing with the eyes of Christ. If that's a real thing, everything is of sacred significance. And so that changed the way that I approached church. I ended up leaving the Presbyterian church I was going to and going to an Episcopal church, because I wanted a view of the Eucharist where, even though I had already embodied that view of the Eucharist as this beautiful table that comes alive, that actually my church didn't. And they would not allow someone who was gay to partake of the table, who was a member of our church, who wanted to help with children. And I was like, I can't stand to be in a church where someone is excluded from the table. Where, if we want to be real, the college students next to me are hooking up. And if you want to fence the table, well, let's fence it equally. If you want to have a conversation with everyone, not that I think being gay is a sin. That's not what I'm saying. But that pastor did. And that was it. I was like, deuces, I'm gone. And it was harder than that. It's very difficult for me to leave that church. But the reality is that saved my life, I think. That saved my life. And so I'm still committed to that vision, even though I don't know what all of that means. And I want people out there to be committed to something. And let's say, even as difficult as my relationship with Christianity institutionalized, white supremacy institutionalized, and like I said, that goes down into churches of color. We got to root out the white supremacy and institutions of color. Not because Christianity is white supremacist, because some Christian institutions are white supremacists. Well, what comes to my head? What song is coming into my head as I'm basically being rooted out from my institution? I wake up with a song in my heart on the darkest day of my life. It's a Jesus song from the Black church that I grew up in. So what is within comes out. And so I don't fight those things. I welcome them. It annoys me sometimes that a Bible verse comes to mind. I'm like, whatever. But I'm like, just be where you are. That's the best thing that I've come to, is not read another Christian book. I haven't been reading the Bible. No, I haven't. It feels like a weapon. It's been used as a weapon against me. Okay. I don't feel guilt about not having a quiet time. I haven't had a conventional quiet time in 20 years. And that's probably the best thing I've ever done, is throw off those conventions. Those don't make the church. Those don't make, and I mean the small c, Holy Catholic Church, all of us, those don't make us. What makes us is living into the suffering of Jesus. And if you don't feel like you can call yourself a Christian, this model that I see of living the Sermon on the Mount is still something I think to be emulated. And so that's how I want to live as I work out my spirituality with fear and trembling. We are spiritual beings. The universe is one. The universe is one. Whether you believe in one God or many gods or no God, the universe is one. And we have to figure out what it means to be at one with the universe in a way that's holistic and inclusive of the dignity of every being. Human, animal, celestial. We are animals, but you know what I mean. So the earth, And we rape each other because we rape the earth. The earth is so connected to that vision. And so I would just encourage y'all to stay on a spiritual journey and to seek that out. One thing that's been helpful to me is trying to read more in a mystical tradition that I didn't read before. And Catholics have done that much better than Protestants for a long time. And so I'm not reading quote unquote church fathers, but I am reading more into folks who write about them and or, Richard Rohr being one. But I stumbled into that. It wasn't like a fad thing for me. And don't disavow that because you think it's a fad. So thinking about, and I haven't read his newest book, The Universal Christ, but I've heard him speak about the universal Christ, and those were the things that I was trying to think into before I heard him label it as that. So feel free to explore and to have conversation. I think people are eager, whoever they are, to have spiritual conversation. So
and that's the catalyst of why we do what we do here. So thank you so much for that and sharing, and being vulnerable with, kind of your journey with the film and then with us in this conversation. I mean, it's been really great. Thank you both. I guess maybe just a closing question for both of you is, now that the film is kind of finished and it's starting to roll out, how is that experience now on the other side of it, then reliving it and re-talking about it? How is that process for you? And then what are your hopes for the film? Like, what do you hope that the film accomplishes in the people and the hearts and the minds of the people that end up watching it?
You go first. It'll have to be briefer for you to say stuff.
I mean, the film, it's fascinating that when I started the film, I thought that it would take less than a year to do. And then I thought it would be out. I actually was trying to get it out before the election in 2016, which is kind of adorable now to think about. Then we ended up filming for 2.5 years. And part of that was because of financial delays. I received grants and had to continually fundraise throughout the process. But I had this deep fear that the film was not going to be relevant anymore, which also seems adorable, right? Because I was like, oh, this moment's going to be past us where these issues are so relevant, these issues of race and Islamophobia and Donald Trump and all the other things that I explore in the film. So I guess from a filmmaker standpoint, it was nice that the film was still relevant when it was finally released. It's a sad commentary on our society that it actually feels more relevant now in 2020 than it did when I started filming in 2015. And again, that is something that has everything to do with the power of art to capture a moment in time. And it's a moment in time that we're still very much experiencing. So all of those issues are more salient now than they even were then, if you can believe it. My hope is that people who watch the film, and I think I'm even thinking specifically about your audience, that they'll know that they're not alone, that these issues of polarization and that sense of, do we all worship the same God? And I'm not talking about the Muslim Christian question with that. Again, I'm talking about, Christians, people who identify as Christian, do we worship the same God? I mean, I think, there's a lot of pain associated with that for many people. It's a painful question to ask. It's splitting families now. It splits friendships. You can't talk to people anymore. People that faith used to be the common ground, and now it's not common ground. And it's almost like you're speaking different languages. I hope that people watch the film and realize they're not alone, and that it gives them some hope in terms of a vision for an alternative way to live out a spiritual life. I think Larycia has modeled that unintentionally, but she's modeled it beautifully. And I think her story is inspirational in that it opens up possibilities for people that are burned out and dismayed and sick of the individualistic, sort of capitalistic view of Jesus that maybe they uncritically embraced and grew up in, and find themselves wondering, like, how do I hold on to things that are still meaningful to me, but try and find different language for it? I mean, the language of embodied solidarity, I personally find very helpful. I mean, it's a really helpful guiding point where it's like, okay, I may not know how I feel about all these other things, but I believe that. And I believe that it is the true and right way to live. There's truth there that is universal truth. And there's truth for me as somebody who identifies as somebody who tries to follow the teachings of Jesus. But it's true in every religion. There's universal truth there. And that's really helpful so that you don't end up just adrift. Sorry, this is my own long answer, but I was thinking, listening to your question to Larycia about advice for people that find themselves in this sort of painful spot. I mean, I've started deconstructing I've never have had a comfortable relationship, honestly, with evangelicalism. I was raised very much in that tradition, but it was never comfortable. But I probably did what would have been called deconstruction in my 20s, and that was a long time ago. But I have a very clear memory of having told my parents I'm not going to church anymore, which was like announcing that I had AIDS or something. I mean, this was a big, terrible thing. And very defiantly, one Easter, staying home in my apartment in Atlanta. And it was the first Easter Sunday of my life that I hadn't been in church. And I ended up watching Jaws on TNM. And it was one of the most singularly depressing moments of my life, because I watched Jaws and just sat there and thought, okay, next Easter, I'm going to go to church with somebody, and then I'm going to eat some ham and have some rolls afterwards, because that is a lot better than watching Jaws.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, but I share that story to say that's, be mindful of where are you headed, right? Because with all the pain and complication, you don't really want to end up watching Jaws on a day that has the potential to provide some hope for you, right? And to lift you up in some way. Don't watch Jaws. So
you may not have known that if you hadn't have done the Jaws
exactly.
day,
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So you kind of do have to go through it, yeah?
Absolutely. But be aware of it. I think that's, I'm glad that I had enough awareness to say, is this better than what I'm doing? And the answer was no. So it's like, okay, how do I then take another step forward and find that place that's comfortable for me? So very long answer. I hope that's one of the things that I hope that people feel inspired to live their lives in a way that moves beyond these really harmful categorizations that I think so many of us have grown up with, of what does it look like to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. I hope that this gives them something to hang on to.
So reliving the story has been difficult in lots of ways. We've lost track. I mean, at least I have. Maybe Linda has a tally of how many times I've seen the film again. Kind of like when we are doing a panel afterwards, to stay in for a little bit and see people, like, where the audience is. Are they super serious? Do they laugh when I say it's a metaphor? That's, sometimes people laugh, sometimes they don't. So that can be telling for us to know how to approach, because it's a very heavy film. When we were in New Orleans at the New Orleans Film Festival, I was sitting next to a woman who didn't know it was me. And she was one of the sponsors of the film. She was with a film organization in New Orleans. one of the co-sponsors, and she was crying basically almost from the very beginning of the film. And at some point she grabbed my hand. And then when I went up, she was like, I didn't know that was you. And so it's very difficult, in part because I have post-traumatic stress syndrome. And it's hard for me to have emotion about the film at all. Except when, Michael Mangus's wife, and Michael Mangus, who stood in solidarity with me in his own way by showing some emails from the provost with Time magazine, and didn't have his contract renewed because he was on a contract basis due to having had a stroke. When his wife talks about the sacrifice in their own body, that feels, in their own family and in their own bodies, that feels really hard for me, but it's not an emotional thing. But it's taxing in a way that I can't describe, except over time, the toll of watching it again and again, watching yourself go through that. And it's weird in the first place to see yourself like, yeah, that's me. Yeah, I probably gained 15 to 20 pounds through all of this because it was so traumatic. To see those things is difficult. But it also has been empowering because I had to accept myself and say, yeah, you went through hell and you gained weight and you'll be okay. And so it's been not healing in the way that I would say that people would think about healing, but it's been an opportunity to accept myself on this journey and to remember that I'm still on this journey. And it actually has been a way for my family to see what happened to me, because my mom was in the middle of cancer. It was my mom who I was visiting in Houston. And so I didn't want my parents to be there for 2 months while I'm going through hell, because my mom needed her health, right? She needed to be home, not with me in Chicago. That reliving it's just been mostly hard, but the good part is meeting people across the country who somehow are moved or angered, moved in a positive way or angered, whether that's you're stupid and you don't know what you're talking about, you're creating controversy, you're stirring up shit, whatever. I mean, it's all good. I mean, because it means the film is moving people to something, to some kind of decision point. But my major hope for the film is that it's an agent of change in that it moves people. I do believe, as I say in the film, that we are all on the front lines. I do believe we are in a time where there will be people who are martyrs for justice. And I'm not a negative person, but I think embodied solidarity is always to the death, because that's what Jesus modeled. The cross is a bloody cross. And so evangelicals like to quote, carry your cross daily, and they put a little metal, cross in their pocket. That's not what it means. It's a bloody cross. And I think that the stakes are higher than they've ever been in my life. I want people to be gripped by the seriousness of the moment that we're in. I also want people to see the comedy. Life is tragic. It's comedic. It's prophetic. I'm a teacher. It's Socratic. And I think the film does all of those things. And so I want it to be a vehicle for a movement, for a moment, for education, for inspiration. And again, that's the power of art. And I'm thankful for it as a vehicle, even though I think there's still part of me that doesn't know what to do with it. It's weird to be like to my students, yeah, there's this movie, this documentary, I'm kind of in it, I gotta go off with the film for this Monday of class, so we're not having class, whatever. And they get it. They've already Googled me, so they already know. So, because everybody Googles their professors these days, so they already know before I tell them. But it's strange, and at the same time, this is how the universe is using, what could have otherwise destroyed me, but I won't let it. So that's where we are. And it's good to be on the journey with someone and like Linda, who gets Wheaton. And another thing is, we wouldn't have done the film. I wouldn't have. One of the only things that helped me decide to do the film is that she was going to be fair to Wheaton College. I want them to believe that the film is intended to trying to show my side of the story, yes. But I only did it because I knew Linda would try to pursue their side of the story, right? I always want to bless Wheaton College in whatever I do. Yes, shake the dust off of my feet, but also bless them. It's part of who I am. It's not my past. It's my present and it's my future. Not that I'm going back there. I won't ever sign a litmus test again. But the reality is, God bless Wheaton College, because that's who I have to be, to love my neighbor as myself. So that includes Wheaton and my colleagues whom I love dearly, and my former students, and they're always part of my family. So.
Well, thank you both so much for coming on the show and sharing about the film and your journeys through it and your journeys leading up to the film. We really appreciate it. So how can people find it? Where can we direct people towards seeing this film and following both of your work going forward?
Yes, I will answer that. So we have a limited national theatrical release that is taking place on March 8th. There might be a few theatrical screenings that take place after that. I would recommend that people go to our website, which is samegodfilm.com. And we have a page there with all of the screenings listed. And so people can look and see if they have screenings coming in their area. Shortly after that, we will be released digitally, which I believe is going to be on iTunes. And I think we have a video on demand distributor that we're working on a deal with. And so really over the next couple of months, the film will be much more widely available to people than it has been. We've had about a year and a half of it being only community screenings, and we're moving past that. So I would steer people to our website, samegodfilm.com, and also follow us on social media, because I try to really make announcements. And that is also, it's Same God Film at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So we have lots of updates on that. And then Larycia can fill you in on where to follow her.
Yeah. Also, we'll be in 10 cities, 3 in California, where you guys are based, twice in LA, San Francisco, like Berkeley. I'll be in Houston on March 8th for the debut. We'll be in Detroit. What other cities am I missing, Linda?
We've got Portland. We've got
Portland, Seattle.
Yeah. I think those are most of them. Yeah. And we might, I think Atlanta, we're doing Atlanta, but that might be March 15th.
Yeah. ATL. So those are exciting. We also have some smaller screenings like universities. If y'all want to invite us out, documentary filmmakers, independent ones especially, don't make money. They make money. She's going to make money because we're going to have this big theatrical release and all of y'all are going to come. But I'm saying this to say we're not independently wealthy. If you want us to come be on a panel, we will. But you got to pay to get us there because it's not free, and the screening rights are not free for a film. It's art. We got to support our artists like Linda. Also, for me, I am on the interwebs. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I've actually got 2, Dr. Larycia Hawkins and Larycia Hawkins is my personal one. Also on Instagram, and it's all at Larycia Hawkins. So my first name is spelled Larycia, and last name Hawkins. So I'm the only Larycia Hawkins out there, unless there's someone impostering me. But find me. I'd love to hear from you and connect with you. And you can tell your local PBS providers if you want to see it on PBS. We've already had major distribution of the film on almost 80% of the country on PBS World Channel. But lobby your stations to show it again, because some people have seen it that way as well. So
yeah. But if I really would encourage your viewers to, if they manage to see the film, to please share about it on social media, because this is such a grassroots effort. It's just, we're a small film, and so it actually really does make a difference if you tweet about us or you you share it with your friends on Facebook. It makes a world of difference. So if you see the film and it touches you and you're moved, please be vocal about that. We would really appreciate it. that is your way of being in embodied solidarity with us.
You bet.
There we go.
Yep.
Yes.
There we go. And we will make sure to put all that information, all those links in our show notes. So make sure that you check that out, and you can always find that at irenicast.com, and we'll make sure that is available as well. So yeah, thank you again for coming.
Yes, thank you both.
I've really enjoyed this conversation, and we're excited that people are going to start seeing this film in bigger numbers, and hopefully we can help spread the word with that. So thank you again, both.
Thank you.
Thanks for a good conversation.
Yeah, seriously.